Sure, the floor is mine, I suppose. Warm greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today's topic is Theoretical Rook Endgames in accordance with Mark Devoretsky's Endgame manual. Why on earth did I choose this topic when there are billions of other topics I could have chosen? Well, for the following reasons. Frequently after the opening and middle game has been played, a lot of energy has been used to play these stages of the game, and often here the energy levels are a bit lower. Here it is useful to have knowledge of theoretical rook endgames so you can get away with thinking less, so that you don't have to reinvent the bicycle and instead just know what you're doing because you've seen the similar positions before. Furthermore, why did I choose rook endgames as opposed to any other endgames? Frequently, the first pieces we develop are knights and bishops, then the queens get into the game, they get traded off, and we're left with the rooks. This is why, in fact, rook endgames are the most common endgames. Furthermore, I have translated the work of Mark Devoretsky from Russian to English because I think his endgame manual is phenomenal. Mark Devoretsky becoming an international master and being a very notable chess author of the Soviet and later Russian school of chess. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2016 at the age of 67, so I hope to pay up to his legacy with this course. Alright, this is what Mark Dvoretsky has to say about rook endgames. Studying rook endgames is both difficult but also important as well. Rook endgames tend to be a bit more difficult than other types of endgames, and the reason for this is that, for instance, with other endgames, knight endgames, bishop endgames, most other endgames that have only few pawns, they're either very primitive or they are extremely rare and will very. It's very unlikely that they will arise in your games. However, rook endgames have a lot of theory, even in rook and pawn against rook, which we will see in the next examples. Let's start with the following example here. It is white to move in this position. We see that the pawn on e7 is very close to promoting, only one more square to promote. Here white has numerous winning techniques in order to get the full point. However, one is supposedly a bit cleaner and a bit more thematic than the other ones. I'll give you 5 seconds to think about it. What would you play in this position if you were white? Alright, rook g1 is the most thematic move in this position. The thing is that if the black king steps to f6, white simply goes king f8, and the promotion of the pawn is inevitable. So king f6 isn't a plausible option for black. Instead, they have to step their king somewhere on the h file, let's say h7 for instance. Now, what is white's winning plan? Let's get it down layer by layer. Well, first in rook endgames, when you're a pawn up, what is the ultimate goal? How can you win? You have to promote the pawn. There is no other way to win simply in rook endgames with a pawn up. This pawn has to promote. So we know that this pawn has to step one square further. Well, there's a king in the way, so this king has to move. Now, if we try to move the king straight away, black is in fact going to be able to deliver checks continuously, and eventually the white king is going to have to run back to hide from checks. It is a very important to keep in mind that checking the king of the pressing side is a frequently employed resource by the defending side. So we will meet it again in the future examples. So white really wants to go king f7 or king d7, but as aforementioned, black is simply going to be able to check the white king continuously. So what do? We build a bridge. We are going to use our rook to shelter our king from checks, and then nothing will come in the way of the promotion of our pawn on e7. And the way to do this is to go rook g4 in this position. Now the rook will block checks along the 4th rank when the white king will step on some of the squares on the 5th rank in this position. Let's see how this plays out in practice. Rook d2, king f7, rook f2 in this position, king e6, rook e2, king f6, rook f2 check, king e5, rook e2, rook e4, blocking the check from the rook on e2, and the pawn promotion is now inevitable. e8 pawn is coming. black is powerless. There's nothing they can do. Black can also try to wait in this position and go rook e1. And after rook e1, what does white do? They rebuild the bridge by going rook g5. And now they're going to shelter the white king with the rook along the 5th rank, while the white king is going to remain along the 6th rank. The idea is to go rook e5 in this position in order to block the rook on e1's control over the e8 square, and then nothing will stand in the way of the pawn on e7 to promote. Alright, let's see if there are some questions in chat. While you perhaps digest how to build a bridge. His name is Israeli and last name is Jewish, and he's from Norway. I'm confused. Alright, so I'm multinational, so to speak. I was born in Israel. I lived there for the first 3 years of my life. I moved to Norway. I'm not sure if I'm happy with it. It was a tough. I was only 3 though. Though my parents are also Russian. So I mean, I did translate this Endgame manual of Mark Devoretsky from Russian to English. So indeed, I'm Hebrew as well. I am indeed Jewish. What if we play rook g5 first instead of rook g4? Let's take a look. I think that might work as well. Though then at least black can go king h6 and also attack the white rook. No damage is done for sure. And rook g5 is definitely winning. Keep in mind that there are numerous ways to win the starting position. However, the most simple and thematic is to build the bridge. And in order to build the bridge, we frequently put our rook on the 4th rank first, since the white king is going to run up to the 5th rank eventually. And if first comes to worst, we're going to go to g5 later with the rook. I think the simple explanation as to why rook g4 is often written in textbooks and slightly preferred over rook g5 is that king h6 attacks the white rook on g5 and makes it unnecessarily complicated, though it's still winning. And now an interesting detail in this position. What if white goes rook f3 in the starting position? What is now the evaluation of this position, if it is black to move here? Alright, if it is black to move in this position, in fact, the position is a draw. The explanation is simple. There are 3 files between the rook and the king on e8, namely the b file, c file, and d file. Now you might be thinking, 3 is an arbitrary number, what on earth? Why 3? Why not 2 or why not 4? 3 sounds like a random number, doesn't it? Well, it's all connected to this thing that when the black rook is going to start giving checks to the white king is going to try and seek shelter. And one of the ways to get out of a checking sequel by the defending rook is to approach the rook, which can be tried by king c7. However, since the distance is 3 files between the king's original position on e8 and the rook on the a file, white's king is now unable to go to b6 and to b8 in this position because the pawn on e7 is going to drop here. And on account of that, this is why the distance of 3 files between the rook and the king ensures that the distance is great enough for a draw to be held. And if the king runs back and then later goes to c5, black goes rook e6 in order to pick up the pawn on e7, and we're left with the king and rook against king and rook, which is a draw, unless you get flagged. And the reason why I remember this very well is that my coach, he took my hand, placed it on the board when I was still quite young. And then my hand covered 3 files. He said, this is the distance that has to stay between the rook of the defending side and also the king of the attacking side. So interestingly, if in this position black's rook would have been on b2 as opposed to a2, the evaluation of this position would still be winning for white, since if they would give a check on b8, king d7 would be played, rook b7, king d6, rook b6 check, king c7, and the white king successfully steps out of the checking sequence. And in fact, we named the side with 3 files or more, could be 4. 3 is the least number of files between the rook and king. We named this side the long side, and we named the other side the short side. So now you want your rook on the long side to be at least 3 files from the attacking king, and your king on the other side so it doesn't get in the way of the rook. Let's take a couple of questions. Oh, the video channels limit is fixed to 25. Oh no, yeah, I wish it would be more. Now black loses because he can't save the pawn or promote. Which of the positions, Chinmay? Yeah, dogs are cats. My sister will kill me if I say cats, so I'm going with dogs. Though I don't really have a big preference myself. She's addicted to dogs. Alright, the next example. In this position, we see that white has this annoying threat of rook b8 checkmate, consequently forcing the black rook on a8 to continuously stay on the a rank in order to defend against rook b8 mate. In fact, this is what we call the passive defense, this defensive system that black is currently employing. Now, it's also very notable that white has an f-pawn instead of a g-pawn. We'll come to that a bit later. And the question is, does white have a winning plan in this position? Or can black continuously shuffle the rook along the a rank and salvage the half point? The answer is yes, white does have a winning plan. Rook b7 is played, and white's winning plan of rook g7 check, rook h7 check, f7, rook h8, taking the rook and then promoting the pawn is inevitable. I went a bit fast, so let me show you how it looks like in practice. Rook d8, let's say, rook g7, king f8 or king h8, doesn't matter, king h8, still rook h7 is going to be played. King f8, rook h7. Rook h8 is now a threat of mate. So black really only has two ways to defend. It's either to go king e8 or king g8 in this position. If king e8 is played, white can go rook h8 check. King d7, the only legal move. Swap of rooks. And in this position, white's pawn is promoting. There are a gazillion ways to do it. A few less. I mean, king g7 wins, f7 wins, king h7 wins, even king f5 wins. But okay, king g7 is the simplest, and then nothing is stopping the pawn from going to f7 and then becoming a queen on f8. Which, after all, the entire idea of rook endgames, if you're up a pawn, it's to promote that pawn. There's no other winning plan. This is quite important to think about, so I am repeating it. Rook g7, king f8. Rook h7, king g8 can also be played, but now white's gonna play f7 in this position, king f8, rook h8, king e7, swap off the rooks. And who is defending the f8 promotion square, may I ask? The black rook or the black king? Neither is the answer, and white just promotes the queen. So what theoretical importance does this position have? It's winning for white. With an f-pawn, the passive defense is not sufficient to salvage the half point. However, does this perhaps change if we have a g-pawn on the board instead of an f-pawn? Let's see if people in the chat have an idea. Does the evaluation change? Feel free to write in the lecture chat if you think this position is winning or not. Curious what people think. G5. It's not. It's a draw exactly, Sin. It's a draw. Actually, if you would have said the wrong answer, I could have said it to you, Sind. That would be a bit funny, but you were correct, unfortunately. Black is able to shuffle the rook continuously along the a rank in this position, and consequently hold the draw. What's the difference, you may ask? Good question. It's that after rook b7, rook g7, king h8, very important moves. I'll come to show you soon why king f8 is losing. King h8, rook h7, king g8. And in the previous example, white was able to go rook i7 in this position, followed by a checkmate threat, and then push their pawn to g7. And as you can see, rook i7, the computer doesn't really let me play it. The chessboard is geometrical, it's 8 times 8. The H file, it's the final file, there's nothing after it. So on account of this rook I7 followed by G7 plan being non-existent, the evaluation of the position is a draw. And if white gets over ambitious and goes G7 with the idea of rook H8, they will regret ever being born after rook A6, and black highly unsincerely takes their rook, and suddenly black is winning actually. So it turns out there's no winning plan in this position for white, and it's just a draw. On the other hand, if king f8 is played, white is winning. King h7, rook a1, rook f7, or rook g8, both are equally sufficient. King g7, and next white will re-maneuver the rook to e2 in this position. Go, for instance, rook b8 to b2 to e2, go king g8, go g7, get the loose in a position, which we covered in our first example, how to convert the loose in a position. So in fact, it becomes theoretically important that you know that when your opponent has a g pawn, a pawn on g6, king on h6, for instance, then you could actually use the passive defense to save the half point. Just shuffle the rook on the a flank, and never after rook g7, don't go king f8. For the sake of chess, for the sake of humanity, go king h8 and hold the draw. It's that simple. Rook g7. It's an automatic reflex. You go king h8 then, and apart from that, you just need to shuffle your rook along the a flank. So it's that simple. With a g pawn, with an f pawn, it's winning. G pawn, a draw. You were correct, Mr. Sin, who said that this position is a draw. Now, a theoretically very interesting position. We start with the simple part of it. In this position, if it's black to move, you hold the draw very effortlessly by going rook b6. This defensive mechanism was actually discovered in 1777, quite a while back, by Philidor Francois, or some sort of fancy French first name. Lived from 1727 to 1795, if I'm not mistaken. Basically, the point is this defensive idea is ancient. It's quite easy to find. Black is prophylactic against white's idea. White wants to go king f6 in this position, after which rook b6 would be ineffective on account of e6, blocking the check. And then white is threatening rook a8, so black will have to go rook b8 to defend against the mating threat. Then white will go rook h7 with the idea of rook h8, which will be the nail in the coffin. And after king f6, rook f1, king e6 is a very convenient way to hide for the white king from the checks of the black rook hiding behind their pawn on e5. So realizing that the idea of white is to go king f6 in this position, black is prophylactic and goes rook b6 in order to cut off the white king from the 6th rank entirely. Furthermore, king e6 isn't a threat on account of rook b6, and the white king has nowhere to hide. Rook b6, and there's no way for white to make progress. They can try e6 with the idea of king f6, and here it's important to stay awake for black and to go rook b1 check, so that the rook can now check the king from behind. Because when the pawn is now on e6 instead of e5, this pawn doesn't serve as shelter anymore, when the white king could have actually gone to e6 if, for instance, rook f1 or something was played in this position, which no longer becomes an option after the pawn has been forced to e6. So we are provocating the move e6 in order to rid white of their shelter effectively. And we just check the white king continuously. And if the white king has an idea to approach our rook, to go to d4 or to go to f4, try to get a bit closer to our rook to evade the checks, the pawn on e6 will be pretty free. We'll just take it and we'll get king and rook against king and rook. And if not, we're just gonna check the white king continuously. So in this position, we just shuffle our rook along the 6th rank. And it's like a bell in your mind. This comes automatic after a while. As quickly as you see the pawn on the e6 square, you know, aha, time to go to the b1 square and check from behind, instead of shuffling along the 6th rank. I'll give you a harder example now. Let's see if people will understand it as well. Let's say that black aimlessly moves the rook a little bit, white as well. And now we get the exact same position with one difference, that in this position it's in fact white to move. And they're trying king f6 in order to win. Is the position a draw or is it a win now? In fact, it's still a draw, but only with the correct defensive mechanism by black. In 1777, Philidor Francois proposed the idea to go rook f1 in this position, check, king e6, and he gave the following variation: king f8, rook a8 check, king g7, king e7, rook b1. It's very important that the a file is taken over by the white rook, so the black rook cannot occupy it and consequently has to occupy the b file. And what do we know? Well, the b file, the rook isn't on the long side. Why? There are only two files between the white king and the rook in this position. Consequently, black is going to run out of checks when they are going to be checking the white king in this position. For instance, e6, rook b7, king d6, rook b6 check. White has run out of checks, and e7 followed by e8 queen is inevitable, and black can throw in the towel, shake hands, or any other expression you like to use for resignation. However, this isn't 1777 anymore. Last time I checked my calendar, at least. It's 2021, I think. And we have discovered another defensive mechanism to salvage the half point here with black. And in fact, it's what we call ataka с тыла in Russian, attack from behind. Going rook e1 in this position, putting pressure on the pawn on e5. The black rook on e1 is eyeing the pawn on e5. Soon we will see why this becomes relevant. King e6, threatening mate, and in order to escape the checkmate, black has three legal moves that are not checkmate in the next move. Four if you count rook takes e5. Rook d1 can be played, but then rook a8 followed by trading rooks, going king f7 and promoting the pawn is um, the end. Couldn't find a more sophisticated expression there. Or to go to f8 or d8, which is a pretty tough choice. Where do you go, to f8 or d8? I'll leave the crowd with this one. Write in the lecture chat if you go to f8 or d8 in this position. Which one of those two would you pick? Okay, I'm very happy with what I see in the chat. Either I'm a genius lecturer or the people I'm lecturing are all geniuses. I mean, everyone has gotten the right answer. I don't know if it's, I mean, humans are sometimes a bit like sheep. If someone writes an answer, everyone goes with the same answer. But I'm going to trust the good of humanity that you all discovered a correct move. You've been very attentive. I'm really impressed how many people found the move king f8. The thing is, indeed, we want our rook to have access to the long side, because in one position, the white rook is going to depart from the a file, making the a file available to our rook, which will consequently step on the a file and obtain the long side. And what is the correct distribution of pieces in rook endgames? Rook on the long side, king on the short side. So instead of going to the long side with the king, which coincidentally in this exact example is sufficient for a draw, though it's not thematic technique, king f8 is the thematically correct move. We put our king on the short side, rook on the long side, and we enjoy life. Rook a8, king g7, king d6. White wants to push e6, and then go king e7, then maybe shuffle the rook to g2 or something, go king d7, e8, e7, get the loose in a position. Black has another idea in mind, so we know that white wants to go e6, so what do? We stop it, we go king f7 in order to take control over the e6 square, taking control over the square with our rook and king, so that if e6 is played, it's a gift, we just take it. King f7, rook a7 check, king e8, and we're back. We go to the previous position. King e8, king f8, rook a8, king g7. Now white can also try rook e8 in order to win. The idea is to defend the pawn on e5 with the rook so that the white king is liberated and can go to d7, e6 and king e7, and white has made decisive progress if all of that is allowed. However, black doesn't fall asleep, hopefully, and goes rook a1 in this position. And now the rook is on the long side and king on the short side. meaning that the black rook is able to check the white king continuously in this position, which is enough to salvage the half point. I'll show you a couple of moves, why not? What's interesting is that if rook d8 is played in this position, a slightly tricky move. Some of you might be tempted to go rook a6, I'd be to king e7, and then it's not so clear. Maybe this also holds as well. Though the thing is, as quickly as the rook is no longer on the e8 square in this position, black can put their rook on e1 so that the white king has to defend the pawn on e5. So rook d8, for instance, with the idea to somehow block these checks on the d file. Maybe rook a6 is sufficient for a draw, I'm not sure. But rook e1 is the thematic way to hold in this position, to continuously eye this e5 pawn, now that the rook is no longer on e8 and is no longer defending the pawn. King d6, and it's on autopilot. We know that e6 wants to be played, so we just prevent it. And it turns out that white is unable to make progress if black utilizes the correct range of defenses. Let's see, so okay, maybe some king d6 move or king d7 can be tried in both of... my bad. That king d7 can be tried. We just check the king continuously, and when the king is far enough away from the pawn, we get our king into the game in order to gobble up this pawn on e5. So the most important things in this technique, this is quite a few moves you have to know in a row. The first one is attack Castillo, attack from behind, as we say in Russia. And after king e6, we go to the short side with the king. As quickly as white wants to play e6 and they play king d6, it's an instinct, king f7. We have to prevent this pawn from being pushed. Not rook d1. Uh, king d6, king f7, rook a7 check, king e6. We start the same sequence all over, and white can try rook e8 as a winning attempt. Rook a1, rook d8. The idea is to shelter the white king against some checks horizontally on a6 or a7, for instance. But now we notice that the white rook cannot fulfill two functions at once. If you run after two rabbits, you will catch neither of them, is a famous Russian expression. So knowing that this white rook has departed from the e file and is no longer indirectly defending the pawn on e5, we put our rook back on e1 to tie down the king on e6 to the defense of the e5 pawn here. That was quite a mouthful. Feel free to ask some questions. It could be chess related or about any other topics that coincidentally are crossing your mind. How to improve in... Okay, I'm a bit more specific than how to improve in chess, hopefully, but anything you want for a minute or two. Thank you, Chinmay. It's quite a mouthful, though. So many things you need to know. First, attack Castillo, attack from behind, king f7 in order to defend the e6 square, keep that square under control. How to play checkers. Um, okay, so myself, I'm not a checkers player, to be honest. I've played a bit of checkers. I mean, not to brag, maybe it's bragging, borderline at least. But my dad was the Soviet champion for his age back in the day, back in the 80s. So that's a question for him, not a question for me. He was like number 30 in the world or something. I have no clue how to play checkers. I mean, I know the rules, but not much more than that. Alright, now we have a similar situation, but slightly different. In the previous example, we saw that white was able to salvage the half point utilizing a technique called attack from behind by playing rook e1 in the following position. Does the same defensive mechanism work if white has a g-pawn? Curious what people think now. Does it work? Does it not work? Is there any difference? Okay, I'll spill the beans. Rook g1 loses in this position. After rook a6 here, rook a8 is the threat, right? And black would really love to go king h8 with the idea to meet rook i8, rook a8 with king i7 in order to maintain the king on the short side and the rook on the long side. It's not possible. King h8, there is no square on i7, so rook a8 would just be a mate. And if black tries some rook f1 with the idea of answering rook a8 check with rook f8, this pawn endgame is easily losing as no one is stopping the promotion of the g-pawn here. And if king f8 is tried instead, which is probably the best try, it still loses though. Rook a8, king e7, rook g8. Can you see what's wrong with this position? The black king is on the long side. The correct piece distribution is the rook on the long side, king on the short side of the defending side. And here the king of the defending side is on the long side. So on account of the wrong piece distribution, white's idea to go king h7 followed by pushing the pawn and then later making decisive progress is inevitable. Here white is going to go rook a1, then rook e1, and this is what we call the bridge. What we saw in the first example, a very useful winning technique, the bridge. I mean, many of the next endgames are based on that black is trying to avoid, or the defending side is trying to avoid, when the pressing side is able to build a bridge. So in fact, it turns out that rook g1 in this position is not enough to salvage a half point. After rook g1, the black king will have to go to the unfavorable long side, and as a consequence, white is going to win. However, attentive listeners already know by now, perhaps, the defensive mechanism to hold this position. It's very simple, and yet so subtle. Rook a1, rook a8. It's a g-pawn, guys. With a g-pawn, the passive defense is sufficient. Black continuously shuffles the rook along the a flank until the end of time, and if a check is given on g7, they go to h8. Never to f8, always to h8. Keeping these two things in mind, black conveniently holds a draw. So this is quite a nice example. I like it because you can use different techniques and then you can try and figure out which one of the theoretical techniques can be employed to salvage the half point or to win the position if you're on the pressing side and want to win. Moving forwards, I have a very delicate example for you here. The first question that is relevant to this position is how many ways do we know that we can hide from checks being given to the king of the pressing side? So let's say black goes for some random rook b8 move, rook a4. How many ways do we know that the black king can escape the checks? The continuous checks from the evil white defensive rook. Alright, the first way is to approach the rook. The rook can give no more checks in this position. I mean, the black king is so far away from the king side where the action is happening now, so it's obviously a draw, but I'm only illustrating a point how to get out of checks by the defending rook if you with attacking king. King f6, rook a6, king g5. You can hide behind your own pawn, that's one idea. Or you could approach the rook until you could shelter from the checks using your own rook in this position. However, there is also an alternative way that is hidden to the inexperienced eye, as I'm sure Aaron Nimzowitsch would have written in his book, My System in Chess of 1925. A major sin in chess is materialism, when you're too addicted to material, that instead of evaluating the position objectively and you simply look at the material count. And the move here to win the game is very paradoxical in the aforementioned sense that black goes f4, pawn takes f4, and now every natural human instinct is to grab the pawn. I mean, why would I give away my pawn for free with f4, right? Why on earth would I do that? Well, ladies and gentlemen, after rook b2, king f1, king f3, the pawn on f4 fulfills a very important function. It prevents the white rook from being able to check the black king. Because if we simply try to go rook b2, king f1, king f3 in this position, then white simply takes on f5, gives continuous checks, and it's a draw. And if white goes rook f8, then rook f2 is winning. So white has to be a little bit careful, but if they go rook g5, it's a draw. So what do? This pawn is the we give away the pawn. And we also use the white pawn as a shelter for our king. King f3. And rook a1 has to be played now to defend against the mating threats, now that rook f5 is a resource which is unavailable. In Russia we call it zonchik, umbrella. The black king is using this pawn as an umbrella. It's raining and you want to get out of the rain. You want to hide from the rain. What do? Well, use an umbrella. So the same can be said for chess. The black king wants to hide from the rain, so to speak. The white rook delivering a check on f5. And with the pawn on f4, this check on f5 no longer exists. The f4 pawn serves as an umbrella for the black king. Now rook a1, we could already see that this rook is passive, and now the pawn isn't a g-pawn either, right? If this would have been a g-pawn, it's a draw, but it's an e-pawn, right? So the passive defense doesn't hold. And with some accurate moves, there are numerous ways to win this. Let me just show you one of the ways. King h2, e2, f5, king f2, king h3. Now, it's very tempting to go e1 in order to win the white rook. But there is a brilliant principle called don't hurry. This pawn is going to e1 regardless. There's nothing white can do about it, so no need to hurry. And in fact, e1, if you play this straight away, you will be a bit sad, as after king h4, f6, king h5, f7, king g6, black will eventually have to give off the rook to the pawn, and it's going to be a draw. So instead of hurrying to promote our pawn after king h3, we play the subtle rook g5, and now we capture the pawn in f5. Then we promote our pawn, and then instead of leaving white with the passed pawn, they're left with nothing, and we're just having a king and rook against king, which I hope you can convert. Shouldn't be an issue. Alright, any alluring questions about life philosophy? Some chess questions which have been boggling your mind lately? Anything that comes to mind? It's important to take breaks once in a while. Materialism, damn, guilty as charged. You're not the only one, Bree. There are so many other people who have fallen to the same trap, so do not feel guilty. It's materialism is very natural in chess. At least, I mean, you're acknowledging it, which is something. f4 is instructed, yeah, for sure, Chinmei. If he pushes instead of taking the pawn, just push your two passers. That's a valid point, sure. I'll cover that. Exactly, f3 followed by a check along the first rank is decisive. Okay, if you go for some rook a1, f3, these pawns are monsters. To survive this position, you cannot. I mean, there's a billion ways to win this. I guess I'll just make some random moves to illustrate the point. E2 is the next move that's coming. There's not much you can do, because if you move your rook, then rook b1 is mate. So yeah, these pawns are just monsters. If they're left unattended, you're going to regret existing on planet Earth. So pawn takes f4 is practically forced. Though it still loses. I mean, you could choose if you want to lose by taking on f4, or if you want to allow the pawns to storm down the board like the Frenchmen did to the Bastille in 1776. 1786, my bad. My bad. 1789, my bad, my bad, my bad. Yeah, that's about right. Yeah. So as Aaron Nimzowitsch puts it, pawns are criminals that must be kept under lock and key. If you let the pawn come to f3, look at how unattended the black passers are. How is white going to handle those bad boys? I have no idea. Interference tactic. There are probably a billion of working tactics, honestly. Distractions. And now, An example featuring the idea of building a bridge. Zaitsev was playing Huebner in 1969. Huebner is a very respected German grandmaster who's still alive today. He's an author of sorts. And Zaitsev is a grandmaster from the Soviet Union. In this position, Zaitsev is pressing for the win with the pawn more. But with accurate defensive mechanisms, there are two ways to hold the draw here conveniently. The first one is just to shuffle your rook along the fifth rank, and the white is unable to make any progress. Rook a5, let's say. And if f5, then you go back, and then rook g1, and there's no way for white to make progress. King g6, you take. King takes f6, and I think rook f4 is the drawing move in this position, putting your rook behind the pawn. This is something we've seen before. And black should hold the draw without too many inconveniences. Or yeah, I think rook b4 is the other way to draw this. Uh, Attacking the pawn on f4, and if f5 is played, you go to b1, and well, we get the same position. The entire idea is that after g5 we could take with the rook. Why does this matter? You'll find out in a moment or two. And okay, if king g3, we can just check the king continuously. It's not a problem either. However, rook b1 was played in the game, which loses. King h5. And here black was counting on rook g1 as a drawing resource, and it's quite natural. They probably thought it's an easy draw. Some king g6, okay, takes, 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 it's a draw, and I can do whatever I want. The game is over, but they relaxed a bit too soon. And white has a defensive, white has a little trick that wins the game, in fact. White can go g5 in this position. And perhaps around this time, Cold Sweat was starting to run down the spine of Hoebner as he realized that pawn takes g5. He was probably only counting on pawn takes g5 when there are a billion ways to draw this position. Most notably, perhaps the passive defense with the idea of rook a8 to a1, for instance. But suddenly, f5 can be played. The pawn on g5, it's used as a shelter for the white king, as an umbrella. Paradoxically, if the pawn on g5 never ceases to exist, the evaluation of the position is a draw. It's simply a draw then. But with this pawn on the board, the black having one pawn more, they're losing. Even though the material is equal and there's basically no pieces left. So I'm not surprised that it's possible to overlook such resources as g5 followed by f5. It's especially if you don't know about this umbrella idea, then it's highly anti-intuitive. But now white simply goes f6, later king g6, and what's stopping the white pawn from promoting? And not too much actually stopping it for nothing actually. So it's a kind of cool example to illustrate how the umbrella works. That you have to be very careful about this idea that rook b1 actually loses due to the umbrella idea. Yeah, exactly, Chinmay. You're right. You're right. That instead of falling into the sin of materialism, thinking, "Oh, I mean, he took my piece. I have to take it back." We think deeper than that and realize that, aha, his pawn can be used as shelter for our king. And now, perhaps this is the last example of the day. Or maybe not. We'll see how it goes. Sometimes your pawn or the pawn of the attacking side, the side who's pressing for the win, is going to be on their side of the board. Previously, we've looked at examples when the pawn is either on the 5th or on the 6th rank. And in these positions, usually it's much easier to hold a draw because the pawn is further away from the promotion square. And here it is a draw even though the white rook on d1 is cutting off the black king on e6 by one file in this position. However, black is using a typical defensive mechanism that you can employ in your games, called the frontal attack. For the frontal attack to work, two features have to be in place. For starters, the rook has to be placed on c8 in this position. If it was on c7, black would be losing. Secondly, the black king has to be on either e6 or e5. Perhaps you'll see in a moment why. Now, white wants to go king before c5, and then this frontal attack idea wouldn't work. So it's interesting, why does the frontal attack work? Well, it's because as quickly as the white king gets out of shelter, goes to b4 for instance, the distance between the white king and the black rook is 3 lines. Fifth line, sixth line, seventh, 3 ranks or lines, whichever one you choose. Does it ring any bells? I think it does. The long side and short side. So it turns out that the distance of 3 files or 3 lines between the rook of the defensive side and the king of the pressing side should be 3 or more for both horizontal and vertical checks. So, as there are 3 lines in between the white king and the black rook, the defensive mechanism of the frontal attack works here. Let's see how the moves play out in practice. Rook b8, king a5, rook c8. A very important move. If black goes rook a8, white is going to go king b6, and pushing the pawn to the 5th rank is inevitable. The most important thing to remember about the frontal attack is that as quickly as the white pawn reaches the 5th rank, the frontal attack is ineffective. Why is this so? Well, let's say okay, c5. This pawn is hanging, but let's say black forgets about it and moves their king. Then white will go king b5. And now what is the difference when the pawn is on the 5th rank instead of being on the 4th rank in this position? The difference is simple. The distance between the black rook and the white king when it has departed from the shelter of the white pawn is only 2 files. 6th rank and 7th rank. And we know that the distance has to be 3 files or 3 ranks or more. But with 2 files or 2 ranks, it ain't gonna cut it. Black is going to run out of checks in this position. And white's going to make decisive progress with her pawn c6, give a check perhaps, go to c8, c7. And eventually white is going to reach the bridge, going to build the bridge in the Lucena position and take the full point. So the frontal attack only works if the pawn is on the side of the board of the pressing side, as in this example here. Let's see how it plays out now. King b4 check, rook c8, the pawn is attacked. If rook c1 is played in this position, then the black king is no longer cut off along the d file, and black can go king d6 followed by king c7, king b7. And with the king conveniently in front of the pawn, there is no doubt about the evaluation of the position being a draw. And if king b5 is played, black just continues the series of checks. And now white has 2 options. If they go rook c1 in this position, king d6, yet again the king is conveniently stepping in front of the pawn with an easy defense. And after rook d4, black has to be very careful. White's threat is very subtle. It's king b7, and if rook c5, king b6, rook moves c5. Why is this so great for white? It's very good because after that, the white pawn is past the 4th rank. It's on the 5th rank, and the frontal attack is ineffective. So now black has to be very direct. King e5 has to be played, attacking the rook on d4. The rook on d4 is in a perfect position. Not only does it cut off the black king along the d file, furthermore it defends the pawn on c4. So after king e5, white has to pick their poison. Either they put the rook somewhere along the d file and say goodbye to the c4 pawn, not a pleasant destiny in particular, or they shuffle the rook somewhere along the 4th rank, but then the black king is no longer cut off. It'll step conveniently in front of the pawn with a simple draw. This is how the frontal attack works, and one final detail which I'd like you to note is that king e5 has to be played, and the reason that the king has to be on the 6th and on the 5th rank in this position is because if the king is on the 7th rank in this position, what happens? Well, the king from the 7th rank doesn't have king e5 as an option to attack the white rook, which is exactly what happened between the two experienced grandmaster Kochev and Smyslov in 1975. So it's interesting that even the best of the best make mistakes in these positions, Smyslov being a world champion from 1957 to 58. Black to move in this position. White to move. And it turns out that if white goes king e4, for instance, it's a simple draw. They're simply maintaining the frontal attack. White, on the other hand, had the idea to go to e2. A very subtle difference. Why does it matter so much? Well, let's see. With the king on e2, white is losing now. So king b5. Firstly, Smyslov improves the position of the king. The ideal placement of the king in these types of positions, with the pawn on the 5th rank and the defending side employing the defensive mechanism, the frontal attack, the king is ideally placed diagonally in front of their pawn by one square, namely the king of the pressing side. And after rook c1, rook d5 is winning, because the king is not on e3 or e4 in this position. White no longer has the option to go king e4 here. And consequently, after king e3, king b2, rook c4, king b3, black is going to push their pawn to c4, and no one is stopping this pawn from promoting. Because this pawn has crossed the 4th rank. It has crossed the side of the defender, and consequently the frontal attack is ineffective. This is why the white king has to stay on either the e3 or e4 square in order for the frontal attack to be effective. A subtle detail I'd like to note is that after king e4, black has to go rook d4 in this position. There's no other way. If they take the rook, then white takes the rook and later wins the pawn. But okay, rook d4, you're just going to win the white rook and be up a rook and a pawn. And here it's just winning. So what can we note? What is the conclusion? King on e3, king on e4. It's a draw. King on e2, it's a loss, if white is using the frontal attack and the black pawn is on the 5th rank. Paradoxically, if white would have said, I pass, and then press the clock, they would have held the draw in this position. Alright, let's see if you've got some alluring questions for me. It could be about chess, could be about life. Both are fine. Distance of 3 squares is the difference. Yeah, Chinmay, you're right. That was one of my questions at some point. True, true. That for the frontal attack to work, the pawn has to stay on the defensive side. No, no, wait. On the attack, on the pressing side, on the side of the pressing side, in order for the distance between the rook, if it is on the A for 1st rank, respectively, to be 3 files. So yeah, you're right. 3 is the correct number. Would you play a live game later? Do you mean that I like play a game from my Lee Chess account or chess.com account and then have this on in the lecture? Is that what you mean, distraction? Unfortunately, I was playing football the other day, or soccer, to all the Americans who are listening to this and will be listening to the YouTube video, and then I was the goalkeeper, and somehow I thought to myself, so the players of the pressing side, they're running quite fast, and in order to defend the goal, I have to be very quick now. So I jump, and they run very quickly towards me. So one guy accidentally kicks me in the head. So after that, yeah, I haven't played too much chess since then, unfortunately. Just had a headache all the time. Yeah, Pawn Storm, yeah, I mean, it was brutal. So after that, I haven't played too much chess. I mean, giving a lecture is different since I know this material so well. Because, okay, in Russia we have an expression, отскакивает от зубов. It's bouncing off my teeth, all this material. I've studied it at least 10 times myself. I mean, I've read the Rook Endgame chapters in Mark Dvoretsky like 6, 7 times or something. So it's very natural to me. So here I have to think a little bit, but not so much. But when I have to think myself in a chess game, oof, that's brutal. Haven't played chess over a month now, actually. Just the headache is too big, and I went to the doctor and stuff. Get well soon. Thank you, Andrea. I'm sure I'll get well soon. Should be fine. Alright, I guess last thing I'd like to mention is that if you enjoyed this lecture, or you learned something new, which I hope you did, I also coach privately. I coach privately at the moment, and I'm particularly looking for students who are slightly higher rated, right? Somewhere between the 1700 and the 2200 rating range. So if you want me to coach you, then just message me on Discord and we'll stay in touch.